It's not taking on the weight of the world. You can stay emotionally healthy and take on the world. You can feel good about your life and who you are and your family and still take responsibility, one chunk or multiple chunks, as many chunks as you feel that you're ready to decipher and learn from. And I think that if we were to all do that, or a critical mass would do that, the problems of this world would disappear.
You have wondered what you would be able to do if you were the ultimate version of you, right? You would then have an easy time creating what you want, and yes, effortlessly enjoying life too. Now, you may know this already, the influence you have over your reality is far beyond what you've been told. Soon, you realize that your outer world is merely a mirror of your inner world, and we're here to connect the dots for you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to God Mode.
And welcome back to God Mode. Good to have you with us, Will. People
Good to
have
be
missed
back.
you.
I missed the people.
Michael, as always, good to see you, my man.
What's up, boys?
We've had an influx of people that have come from military backgrounds. After our episode with Sergeant, we can't say his name, everybody was like, wow, this is cool. Like a lot of people have served. And so this last episode prior to this, we talked about, maybe we added the webinar between that. But the last time you and I talked, it was about principles that the military teaches that unless you go through the military, you typically don't get. The exception being upgrade and really high performance, mindset improvement centric organizations. Other than that, that information is not out to everybody. People need this, right? And one of the topics that you'd mentioned in our conversation that we could riff off of for a whole episode was the concept of the confidence versus egotism in somebody, which is you can't have confidence without having a little bit of an ego, right?
Yeah.
That's what people, how do we reconcile that?
It's something that you have to really take inventory of because it's almost like an evolution of your mind, right? As you begin to figure out more about who you are internally, you realize that things that maybe you did when you were middle school, high school, just figuring out who I am as an individual, right? Because you're separating from parents and your caretaker and the environment. And there's an egotism hey, I'm looking out for self. Right? Because I'm developing myself. So I'm looking out for myself. So that's why in that last episode that you and I did, I talked about how we could talk about the ego for so long because there's so many layers like an onion you could peel back on it. I do want to say if you're military, if you're a veteran or if you're active military,
Emergency services,
firefighter, police, we thank you for your service. And we do have discounts for our programs with Upgrade. 25% off for everyone who's served and is continuing to serve because you're doing the work. Honestly, that is the true bravery. So thank you.
Seriously. This notion between, in order to be, you said something before we started rolling, which is that you believe that you need to have ego as a precursor to actually having self-confidence. Instead of it being that person's either self-confident, but he's awesome and there's nothing, or that person's egotistical. It's well, that egotistical person, and everybody listening can think of, I know somebody if I think of, who do you know that's got a big ego? It's 5 people pop up into my head. But that also means that they have self-confidence, right? So how do we determine, how do we separate those and make it make sense so that the people listening today, a lot of people are going into entrepreneurial journeys. There's a bigger breakaway from working for somebody else than ever. People are starting their companies or they're leaving the military and they're getting into civilian life for the first time. And in the military, you were taught that your self-confidence, your ego is your superpower and it will allow you to power through a tough situation, believe in yourself, self-rescue, no one's coming to save you. And so there's a strength that comes with that, but there's also a balance that needs to be struck there, right? Because otherwise you start pushing people away or you won't take feedback from somebody or you'll go 5 years looping the same patterns because it's not obvious to you that your ego is not your amigo, right? So, I think that there's a lot to cover here.
I think that's going to be the podcast title. Your ego is not your amigo.
Yes.
That's what's up right there.
Iconic.
I think it comes back to a lot what we talk about this podcast and what we teach in Upgrade. What's the definition and the labels behind it? So we in society, we generally have a generalized term that having an ego is a negative connotation towards it, or that so-and-so has an ego, you're egotistical, whatever, right? What I've studied, and I kind of adopted this theory from Dr. David Hawkins, is that the ego is the preservation of self and it is a survival mechanism. So he kind of coined it as like, almost look at it as like this puppy dog, right? And we needed this puppy dog to get you to be an adult dog, right? But the ego survived out of just making sure that you survived. You and I joked before the podcast that if you and I were being chased by a T-Rex, I don't have to outrun the T-Rex. I got to outrun you.
Yeah.
So for
Eat him.
my ego might push you in front of the T-Rex so I could survive. And if we move forward to 2024, in competitive markets, we probably see that behavior still going on, where someone's like, "This is a this is me versus you situation." It's I'm gonna get the leg up. Maybe I say something. Say we're in the real estate agent world, right? And I was in the real estate world too, so I saw competitive things like this. It's like, you don't want to work with that guy. Do you know what he did? Do you know what that guy did, man? Like, you don't want to work with him. Come work with me, right?
Really?
So there's a bit of an ego thing there because I'm trashing on someone else, thinking that that's a scarcity mindset. That to preserve my income, that I have to trash on someone else. So it's an egotistical play.
Wow.
Where my expansion, the lens of this is more into the abundance, where there's not a me versus you. There's an abundant world that we live in. And that's when you can go, okay, the ego is a foundational step for me to get to self-confidence, me believe in myself so much, and then also believe in my environment so much that other people are good, right? That everyone can have a win-win mentality. So to me, it's an evolution and it's a foundational starting point. It's not, we have to change the connotation, the negative connotation about it, that if someone does something egotistical, yeah, they may do something that harms us or whatever they do, right? But they're looking out for themselves first. So it's a survival mechanism. And at the core, I'm sure we have all done things at times that we're like, okay, this is in the best interest of me.
Wow.
Yeah, ego is an interesting thing. How do you let it go without having one?
How do you let it go without having one?
I mean, I guess I would question you back in terms of what are we letting go exactly?
Ego.
Yeah. So would I want to let go of the feeling of to survive? Probably not, right? So I think for me, letting it go without having one would be knowing that like it's not so much about ego for me, and it's not so much about letting it go. It's just knowing that everything I'm doing is encompassing surviving and thriving for me. So there's not a either or. It's always a both. So
I've never seen ego as a problem. I think that it's how the ego responds.
for you specifically, or for like someone else who's ego?
I think that the label of ego is some lazy way of saying that person is wrong in how they're confident about something.
Okay, so you're saying someone else is using it as a mirror of what they're inefficient with?
Yeah, like for example, let's say some guy says, oh, that person's really egotistical. That's why, you know, they got big ego. That's why their relationship's not working, or that's why their business is not working. They're not taking on feedback.
Yeah, we hear that a bunch.
Right before the podcast.
Yeah, and you know, to me, it's the person's inability to see what they normally wouldn't see or take on feedback. It has to do with lack of humility and open-mindedness, and sometimes intelligence rather than ego. I think it's a term that's too generalized.
I think it's a crutch too. Like people use it as a crutch and be like, oh, you're that person's egotistical. That's why they're not doing it. Or they'll use it as an excuse, right? Where, to your point, intelligence, skill set, that's usually what they're lacking. So that's where they're lacking the self-confidence, right? I think I've used it as, and the reason I'm saying I'll speak from my perspective, I used it as a crutch or an excuse back in the day for either getting what I want or not getting what I want, blaming it on the ego. So
Interesting.
I think it can be used as an excuse, and that's when you can lack self-confidence of yourself if you're using something like a label as an excuse.
Andrew Bustamante, he's a former CIA guy, and he's been doing podcast circuits like crazy.
Great hair.
Oh, the coolest hair, you know? And
No, the guy with the puffy...
big puffy cool hair.
Oh, cool.
And he talks about this one thing. It was Danny Jones or Sean Ryan that asked him, and they said, if you could go through your book of cool spy tricks that you know, what is one thing that everybody listening to right now could learn by the end of you explaining it and change their lives in a big way as a result of knowing it. What's one of those CIA spy tricks? And he goes, one of the biggest first things you will ever learn is the power of getting out of your own head and your own perspective and being able to see the same situation through somebody else's eyes. Steel manning it, which we talked about a little bit last time. But he's like, the second you can do that, the situation adds dimension. We look at it in a 2D flat thing. This person did this. They obviously did it with the intent of X, or this company made this move, or whatever it might be. And you're looking at it only as these signals are occurring. Here's how it's impacting me. But the reality is like when you can get into the perspective of, oh, me and my partner are not getting along. We're arguing about the same thing. But the ability to completely withdraw the ego, to slip into their heads and to look at it through their eyes is a superpower. And I was like, well, dude, like, couldn't everybody do that? But the fact that that's one of the first primary principles that the agency would teach, and that was his go-to on really big shows, he's like, it illustrates that not enough people like do that well, or don't consider it, or like they'll do it 20%, you know? And it's like that full like surrender of the ego and being like, let's say that I was 100% trying to see it from their lens. Like, what would that look like? Even to the part where like the roles that I'm contributing, like where are my mistakes in that? And like there's a real power in being able to embrace that, like in vulnerability. And it's like a exercise of shedding the ego. Because if you can do that, I think the next phase of that comes in, which is confidence, right? It's that self-assuredism. Because you're like, yeah, like I'm able to completely strip away that framework that I need to like cling to in order to hold my identity together, hold my position together. It's like, no, what if you just got rid of it? Like, who cares? And then you get to see something new, and you may still be right by the end of it, but you may also realize there's dimension to everything.
I think you've just given one of the best definitions of what ego is versus confidence. Confidence is someone being able to know where their position is, but also being able to go see it in other people's perspective without that attachment, and are humble enough to accept other perspectives, and actually accept it, right? Whereas ego is they're only willing to see their own perspective. I think that's probably one of the best definitions.
See their own perspective, and then maybe attach themselves to the limiting beliefs and limiting decisions that are feeding into that perspective too. If say there's a listener out there right now who is, maybe you're making just over 6 figures. Maybe you're even doing over 7 to 8 figures, and you're doing pretty well. But there's this limiting belief, limiting decision story that you keep running off that you can't make it past X amount because you have this egotistical boss, right? Or this egotistical coworker or something like that. And that's feeding into why you haven't allowed yourself to go to the next level yet. Well, part of the first step you could do is something what Brady just suggested, and you could begin to be completely compassionate towards that person. Begin to really understand another human being's perspective. And that may deconstruct your entire story altogether of the ego. It may deconstruct the entire limiting belief and limiting decision story. I think when someone gets attached to the ego and they're looking for confidence, it's because they still want to hang on to anything that's familiar. It usually comes back to that.
The person who observes ego in others tend to have the most ego.
Interesting. Yeah, they're looking for it. Sure. I think it's crazy when people are rude to service workers.
Say it again?
Like service workers, like you got your your waitress.
Oh, yeah.
It boggles me. I feel like Gen Z and then like millennials and then like maybe the generation after to some extent, you don't see that very much. I think most people have enough cognitive capabilities to be like, that person's working 10 tables. They got a lot going on. They got the kitchen back there yelling at them. So it like boggles my mind when someone like gets mad at a barista or a waitress or something, like the Karen cliche. They're like, I want to see the manager. And you're like, dude, last thing the manager wants to do is talk to you. They're trying to do a thing. And it's like, well, my ego here, you brought me the wrong fries. I'm going to let you have it. That's crazy.
Yeah, they're trying to have little wins in their world. People who are lashing out. I mean, to take it out on someone who's serving food, first of all, that's not the person you want to start with.
Ooh.
Chris Smith and I actually had a funny story about that in Vegas where we were with younger people at that Fun Launch Live, and Chris and I tipped the waiter $100 before he even gave us like stuff.
That's cool.
And then he was like the nicest guy in the world, and then younger people were like looking at Chris and I like, why'd you do that? It's like, well, first of all, this guy, you can tell he's in a hurry. We also want to get great service, and to get great service, you gave off great energy. So we started with great energy. Wow. And they were like, what? Like, why would you do that? And Chris was like, it's all right.
Shout out Chris Smith. We love you. That's cool. That's way cool. That's a great illustration. There was this study that was by a lady named Emily Bianchi, and she was a professor at Emory University, and she used 2 types of personality tests to measure narcissism. They had 32,000 participants. So she's measuring levels of narcissism in different groups across different segments of industry. And what they found was that people during hard economic times they measured that by unemployment rate, but during hard economic times, people who were 18 to 25 were less narcissistic later on in life than those who came from an age where there was a lot of economic boon, which is an interesting thing to illustrate. It's like, okay, well, if people come from hardship or they have to tap into those survival instincts, which, like you said, the ego is the survival instinct, but you can't just operate that. You have to keep leveling up to get ahead and to survive and put food on the table for people. And it's like when money is scarce, when opportunities are scarce, and we live in an amazing time, so we have neither of those things are our issue. But it tends to, in a long tail of studies, shows that people have less narcissism over time because they had to power through something. They didn't have everything handed to them. Therefore, there was no entitlement. So it was just their own ego of, I deserve to live. And it's like value levels. Like this seems to really like parallel with value levels, which blows my mind. Like, I'm not saying it's a perfect science, but I'll be darned if I can find like a better way of measuring with a yardstick how evolved somebody is. Like a value level 3, it's like, yeah, I'll push you towards the T-Rex. I'm getting out of here. Value level 4 is like, well, we are the council of T-Rex regulators, and like, and you pay your tax to the T-Rex Protection Agency, and everything's fine.
Value level 6, just like, protect the T-Rex.
Yeah.
Some people who don't have context of what we're talking about right now jump into our trainings.
We could maybe touch on how value levels work. We haven't talked about it in a couple dozen episodes, but I want to hear what you say.
Yeah, I'll tell a story. So I had a fascinating experience the other day. And this is something that I learned about my own ego. So I was driving from the airport to a birthday dinner and got there like an hour late because my flight was delayed. So I was in a rush and I'm like, oh, I just need to get in. There was a long line in front of the hotel. And I'm like, I see cops standing there. I'm like, why are there cops at a dinner venue, right? And so I was like kind of curious. And so I got up a little close because I was staring at the cops, got up a little close to the entry over here. And my wallet took some guy in the arm very gently, like, barely a touch like that. And then I was like, I didn't even notice. He stares at me for like a good 10 seconds. And I was like, oh, hey. Did my wallet touch you or something? Like, because I felt a little bit. So I was like, oh, I'm sorry if that happened. Now, what happened in the next 30 seconds blew my mind. Like, blew my mind. And I think this is a microcosm of what an ego is.
William got yelled at in the hotel lobby.
No, there was no yell at.
Oh.
No. I remember taking Krav Maga. Like the best solution is always to de-escalate, especially when someone is not in a good mental state. But how do you trigger someone with a teeny little touch of your wallet, right? So I was like, oh, sorry, my wallet touched you. He's like, that's a purse. You know, I have like a big wallet.
Oh, you're like over across the body satchel?
No. It's like one of those long wallets from
He
Louis
said
Vuitton.
it was a purse.
And then I'm like, I have so many responses, but I'm not going to escalate this. I'm like, sure, it's a man purse. And then he kept going. Now check this out. I waited for him to respond because I saw that he wanted to say something. But I could see it in his eyes he was either a little drunk or something's going on, right? He's like, oh, that's cute, with like a very resentful tone. And I'm like, okay, I'm definitely going to de-escalate or this guy's going to get arrested because we got 2 cops right here. And if I say something, it's going to trigger him. I'm like, thanks. And I walked off. Now, I'm like, what would cause someone to do that in a social setting?
Seriously.
To a complete stranger? Were they abused as a child? Were they abused right now? What is happening, right? What kind of, maybe it's not abuse, maybe there is some trauma going on for them to have to take it out on a complete stranger. So I noticed he was with a woman. And if he's listening, I'm like, he should start in episode 1.
He's a fan of the pod.
and take resolution big time, right? I'm like,
Schedule a call.
Yeah.
I noticed how he was a woman, and I'm like, I feel bad for her. I don't know what it is, but when you meet someone, you could just sense that there's someone that wants to take everything out externally. Now, at that precise moment, I had a lesson. I was like, wait a second. Was I not rude a moment ago before I got out of the car because my wife said something to me? I'm like, I need to apologize.
Wow.
You were rude to him or to your
To my wife.
Oh, gotcha.
I'm not calling it karma, but I am saying if I'm not okay with a complete stranger, even with the slightest little bit of being triggered and then taking it out on me, how is it okay for me to not be kind towards my own closest person? And so I think that moment, it's like a dissolution of ego. It's a moment of, oh my gosh, I have to text her or call her and apologize because, once again, I'm not saying this caused that, but that was a mirror to me. And if someone's ego is too thick, an experience like that wouldn't be enough for them to be like, oh, I need to apologize to my loved ones. They'd be like, oh, what an asshole, moved on.
Yeah, unrelated.
Yeah. So to me, I realize how many of these things are going on in our world where something happens, but it's like a mirror of something else that we've done, but we completely are oblivious because of ego.
Yeah. I mean, for someone who's just listened to our podcast for the first time, that might be a lot. This is the level and the standard that everyone on this podcast and Upgrade plays at of what level of responsibility you're willing to take for your life. Because you're right. You could say that this person, people who act out like that, usually they're looking for attention, right? Let's go down the potential of abuse road. That's probably how they got attention back in the day. How someone loved person gave attention from derogatory remarks.
Wow.
So how they give attention out, same way. This is not a generalization. I haven't met that person, right?
Yeah.
But what William did, instead of being like, okay, this person's seeking attention, he was like, wait, how did I cause this? Right? Even though you say you didn't cause it, but you're playing at that level of responsibility. How did what I did just attract it? Because our existence is vibration. How we're existing in that moment is a vibration of what we're attracting.
A scientifically measurable vibration, by the way.
Yep.
Yes.
So how was William existing prior to that moment? He took inventory of that, looked at it, and said, okay, was I vibrating at something that then attracted it in the world? And, okay, how can I bring resolution to that?
Wow.
So it's the next level of willing responsibility that you can go beyond the ego, you can go beyond confidence, right? It's the next level of just, hey, I exist. And how am I existing in this world right now?
And that brings me to my next point. This world is literally an expression of the human ego. All the conflicts, all the wars, all of the cheating, all of the problems. It's a collective expression of our ego as humanity. So even if we were to think that we are not the problem individually, I'm not saying we are, but collectively, this is an expression of our collective ego.
Wow. One of the things I've admired, like in the years I've known you guys, is the speed at which you attribute that to that highest level of consideration. And I feel like I get a superpower just in spending so much time with you guys. People will travel across the world, like from Romania, shout out Chris John, to sit here and learn from you for 4 days. And they'll get on the call just to like toss some things around with you and help you work through them. So for me, like being able to spend so much time with you guys, the idea of when something pops up, there must be a mirror I'm not aware of is not a natural way of thinking. That's weird, right? To be like, okay, I had this thing. It happened to me. I sure as crap didn't just ask for that. but where did I? It's a crazy way to think. But then if it happened anyway, this is where my head goes. If it happened anyway, then is there something that you can take away that's a net positive? Because it's already happened. So where's the positive in it? Where's at least a lesson? Where's at least a modicum of humility or a dissolving of the ego or an increase in self-confidence? If you do that, like we talked about, like, oh, take the trash out. Sure, I will. And then it's like the communication, like it's a small thing, but in everything that happens, if you can find a lesson in it, it's like the same thing's going to happen, but you might as well have some awesome learning along the way. Like this is similar but unrelated. Every time that we see 11:11 on the clock, I've attributed that, angel numbers, whatever, but I'm like, that must mean that I lined up with this at the right time and that I am headed in a good way. And that's why people have, I don't know, like thoughtful tattoos, or that's why they have these things that they anchor. Like you have an anchoring technique, and I did this quite a bit. Like I went into a consultation recently and I was anchoring, and you built that for me like years ago. I pinched my lobe and I have all sorts of feelings and specific memories attached to that. And I'll go months without doing that. And then pink, there it is. I have this proper lesson attributed to this action or a muscle memory that says, if something happened, there is a lesson to learn from it. And people think that's crazy. Oh, a war broke out. How is that your fault, William? How are you responsible for Ukraine?
I think it's something that you could anchor instead, and someone could, this is a suggestion to take on, anchor that this is happening for me rather than to me.
Yes.
If someone can begin to have that your environment is happening for you rather than to you, then that will begin to trigger the mirror easier for you.
On that note, and answering your question, a lot of it, people will say it's not your responsibility. Something's happening out there, right? And I found myself asking this question a long time ago. I'm like, what's the highest level of thinking I can adopt into my life that allows me to grow in two specific things? One is the understanding of correspondence, meaning what's going on outside and what's going on inside, how are they connected? And the ancient people talk about this law of correspondence. They call it as above, so below. They have many ways of calling it, right? They're like, they can see the stars and they'll predict events. And there's a lot of things that the ancients were very accurate and very good at. And during that time, people would see that nothing is disconnected from one another, all of us and the cosmos and everything, from the mineral kingdom all the way to the plants and animals, all the way to the humans and beyond. We saw ourselves as connected, spiritual, emotional, mental, physical, all of it. Then comes industrial age, where we're taught we're separate from one another and how we're individuals, not collective anymore, how we're different and not responsible for one another. And that's brought about an age of scientific exploration and advancement. What's interesting is it's like, and I'm okay to go a bit deeper since it's our podcast called God Mode. So it's like the egg in the beginning, fertilized before it was divided. There was no separation, and then there was separation, and then there was more separations, more and more separations, and then it becomes the cells of the body, and there are so many cells inside of every one of us, right? The cells might be individual to one another, but they work together as a collective. Well, humankind has forgotten that we're actually a collective as much as we are individuals. So when it's like the brain wouldn't say, well, that's just the hands. And the hands wouldn't say, that's just my legs.
Right.
And the nose wouldn't say, those are just my eyes, or the eyes, nothing to do with me. They would realize they are one with one another.
Wow.
So in short, oftentimes egotism is what is needed, like what we were talking about earlier, before one can become whole. The separation before the evolution.
Wow.
I mean, even in scientific terms, they say energy is neither created nor destroyed. So if there is no separation from that egg, the energy is still spreading from us to, I think that's really powerful what you said. Like, I wouldn't say this is the hand. I would say this is my hand, right? So it's a part of me. So why can I not say that about you guys or my environment? Like, this is a part of me. Therefore, I'm influencing it with my vibration somehow. I think if I'm open to it, how much time we got?
I'm good.
We're good?
Yeah.
I think I'll share a quick story about the German Shepherds.
Oh my gosh. Do it.
yeah,
Because
please.
I think it's a good correlation to this in terms of the law of correspondence.
And I didn't even agree with you when you told me this. I was like, brother, I don't see how this is your fault anyway. It was very interesting.
I think you're coming from a friend perspective, so I appreciate it in the moment, right?
Yeah.
So about 2 months ago, I was out walking my dogs around our old apartment, and my 2 dogs and I were attacked by a German Shepherd. And one of our dogs was injured. I got the dog off. The owner got the dog off. And at that time, it was just like dog incident, dog fight. It happens, right? All good. 3 weeks later, fast forward, I was staying in an Airbnb at a time because my house that I purchased was under construction, so didn't want to live in a work construction site.
Reasonable.
Yep. And we're on a completely different part of town, like honestly, like 30 minutes.
35 minutes easy.
Yeah, 30, 35 minutes. Actually closer to where,
Yeah.
like a different neighborhood near where you are. And I'm out walking my dogs again, and I get attacked by a German Shepherd again. All right. Now, it was a very scary situation because this was a much larger German Shepherd. The German Shepherd was running at me and my dogs. I ended up throwing down my dog's leashes and attacking the German Shepherd so he couldn't get after my dogs. And, I was wrestling with it. It scraped me a little bit. Nothing serious. Thankfully, this owner came out and helped me restrain the dog. In that moment, though, I looked up, and that was the scary part for me, where my dogs were running towards a very, very busy intersection of a road. So I started to get this massive anxiety, right? Massive like panic attack because I'm seeing dogs who I love run towards the road. I'm like, this never ends well. And I start chasing after them. And little side note of the story, I was wearing flip-flops at the time. So when I tackle my dog, flip-flops are off. I'm running barefoot, hot pavement, glass, rocks.
Arizona.
Yeah, my
Oh my
rocks,
gosh.
feet were beat up. And so I'm running. And, I do believe I had a good moment with, this is my perspective, that was intervention from God. If I'm open to saying that, right? Because I was running and I said, God, please have my dog stop. And in that very moment, my lead dog, Rufio, turns right and books it down a street. And Emerson, the second dog, she's following him. She books it down the street too. So I'm chasing after Emerson. Emerson actually stops to take a poop. She literally got the poop scared out of her. So I was like, got up to her, grabbed her leash, and I look up and Rufio's still running through stop signs, but somehow not getting hit. And I'm like, Emerson, we got to run. And so we're running, just booking it after him. And he goes through 2 more stop signs. Cars are swinging by him. No cars hit him.
Oh my gosh.
He takes a hard left, runs it down. Emerson and I are running after him. And a guy was on the corner street. He's like, yo, little dog, run that way. Because he could tell I'm chasing after the dog. So this dog ended up running back to the Airbnb that we had been at for 3 days and is hiding underneath my Jeep when we get there, right? So the reason I'm bringing this story up, because yes, in that moment, I was like, oh my God, I think there was an intervention from God, because if the dog had just stopped, I probably would have been like, oh, he listened to my voice, right? He listened to my voice, he stopped, thankfully. But he somehow, with 3 days of being in an Airbnb, ran all the way back through like over a mile of running. My feet were so bloody.
There's
blistered.
you just chasing him. Like,
Should have seen Brielle's face when she came home, saw my feet. She's like, what happened?
oh my gosh.
So we get back and, I'm panting, right? And I'm just in this mode. And I'm like, in that moment, I was like, you were the common denominator, Michael, in these 2 dog attacks. Yeah, my other dogs were
You
there,
said dogs were too.
but I was walking them, right? Like,
yeah.
I'm controlling it. I'm trying to take responsibility. So in that moment, I was a little like panic attack, and I ended up calling William, and I was like, okay, there's something going on here. I need to get to the source code of this. I need to get to the root cause, because I'm the common denominator here of in 3 weeks span, 2 German Shepherds have attacked me, right? It's not like 2 different dogs, 2 different German Shepherds at completely different locations. So we got to the source code by doing some advanced techniques that William teaches in Acceleration and Beyond. Actually, we teach in evolution now too. And the source code for me was that pain, which I was feeling a lot in the time, both physically and mentally and emotionally, was highly correlated to me to courage, and highly correlated in a positive way to courage. And then courage was highly correlated to nobility, and nobility was correlated to success. So I was unconsciously running this entanglement program that, because I grew up in a Japanese martial arts background with my father teaching this, that pain was correlated to courage, nobility, and success. And I was still running this program that until I got success, I needed to have pain. And I hadn't had a lot of pain in my life recently. Things have been pretty good with us. Like, yeah, there's stressful times. We're all going through quote unquote challenges, right? But I really hadn't felt any pain. So it was such a mirror for me in that moment that I was still unconsciously searching for pain physically, emotionally, and mentally, just so I could feel success.
Wow.
And I remember telling you that, and you said, like, I don't see how this is related. But it was just, it had never struck me as clear as day as it could in that moment that I was causing this. And people would be like, how could you cause this? You don't control the world. I'm like, I get that. I don't control the world. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I caused this program in my mind because it's entangled in my neurology. So we have to begin to be like, how entangled are we, as your metaphor with the cells and the egg and the sperm, right? As it spreads out, how entangled are we with our own internal neurology and then our external neurology? How much influence and cause do we have on these things that can we play this 100% responsibility level at? So I share that story because as I move forward as a business partner, as a friend, and soon to be a father, I want these programs to be very clear to me so I don't pass down programs I don't want to my children, right? Sometimes people in our families, at least in my family, I won't speak for your guys' families, but we kind of have this like sarcastic thing, like, oh, he's a Mahoney, so he's probably going to be like eating a lot of food. Oh, he's a Mahoney, so he might drink a lot, right? Families say that stuff. Why not we pass down things we're proud of instead? Things that like we really love. I mean, I think that's where if you become super aware of what you're good at and what you love, you're going to transcend past the ego. You're going to go into whole different levels. But you got to play a different level of responsibility. Maybe you don't have to play our level of upgrade, but you got to play a different level of responsibility.
Some level of different responsibility.
Yeah.
Wow.
And, look out for German Shepherds.
I hung out with a beautiful German Shepherd the last
They're
few
beautiful
days.
dogs, man. I'd still absolutely hang out with a German Shepherd.
It's not those two.
I think that there's a reason we call this world, when we think to ourselves or talk to other people, perhaps, you're like, it's my world. Like my hands. I think that oftentimes, instead of not taking the world as yours, I think it's my encouragement to the listeners and the viewers to take this world on as theirs and see how far they could go. Because it's one thing to say, I'm gonna not be taking that much responsibility because how dare I, right? I'm not some special person to say this is my world. But I think that it's worthy of consideration to say, this is your world. It's like anyone who runs a company or is a part of a company. You want that person to take on the responsibility and make them feel that this is theirs so that they take ownership, right? People look, entrepreneurs are oftentimes looking for partners and staff members that take that level of responsibility. Why don't we do the same for the world? That's one key way to actually remove the ego or remove the negative effects of the ego. It's to take this whole world on and say, this is my world. Now, there's a very unspoken thing that people need to be aware of, is that when you take on the world, it's not the weight of the world. It's just beginning to see the correlation, the correspondence inside, outside. It's not taking on the weight of the world. You can stay emotionally healthy and take on the world. You can feel good about your life and who you are and your family, and still take responsibility, one chunk or multiple chunks, as many chunks as you feel that you're ready to decipher and learn from. And I think that if we were to all do that, or a critical mass would do that, the problems of this world would disappear.
We need to give them better skill sets because if I may, and this is going to be my perspective only, Michael Mahoney said this, I think that's what's wrong with traditional psychotherapy, that they take on the weight of their clients, right? Traditional talk therapy, mental work, they take on the weight of their clients and then they pass it out onto the world, right? So there's this cycle. And it's not just in that field, so I'm not going to be just harping on that field, but I think that's what Upgrade does differently. We show you how to give you tools of how to look at this is my world and how am I influencing it? How can I take responsibility of it without taking, as you said, that pressure on and being like, oh, I'm responsible for it, or it's my fault, or I'm to blame, right? No, it's a level of responsibility of how much you can control and influence without being at blame or thinking like this is your fault.
That makes more sense.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. There's a power in being able to say, like, don't take on the fault, but look for the lesson. Like, take on some semblance of responsibility, which is cool. That's profound. In the shoes of an executive, a business owner, there was another study, and I love researching these, and Tyler pulled these together. And this guy's name's unfortunate. His name's Dr. Paul Nutt, with 2 T's, out of Ohio State University. But he did this 2 decades of research, right? So he conducted this study with hundreds of organizations on why business decisions are made and then why companies can go awry. So he actually discovered 3 key reasons why 50% of certain decisions lead to failing. And more than 1/3, so the 3 points are this: more than 1/3 of all failed business decisions are driven by ego, which is interesting because as a business owner, you do need to have confidence. You need to not agonize over every decision. We talked about the menu anxiety, like when we sat down and it's like, do I pick the burger or the fish? It's like, just pick something and move forward. There's a correlation between doing that and having success. Make quick decisions and move forward. And can be, I guess, in some cases, an ego-driven decision. The second point is that nearly 2/3 of executives never explore alternatives once they make up their minds, which is interesting. It's like, well, yeah, I made a decision. I got to stick with it. And of course, if I agonize, should I have taken left? Should I have turned right? Should I have ordered the steak? Should I have ordered the pasta? What is that going to do? Like, move forward for a while. But there's also an inflexibility with that. Yeah. Like some of them become inflexible. Like, I won't listen to anyone on my board. Or if I'm the one and I made these last 12 decisions and they were all right, then I'm going to make the 13th one, The third point was 81% of managers push their decisions through by persuasion or edict, not by the relevance of their ideas. So they throw their weight around, or they're really good at convincing people, which is interesting. So those 3 data points are correlated in this massive study about why 50% of business and business decisions ultimately fail, which I find fascinating, especially the manager. There's like a manager class that emerges, and people are like career managers, or like, what do they call them? Like surplus elites. These like people that are hired and like, yeah, come in. You've been a CEO of 10 other companies and we're going to put you here. And they come in and they're kind of like, well, can we do a RIF? Can we do a reduction in forces? Can we do this? And it's like, they may not, their ego is telling them do these things without sitting down and getting to know maybe, what do you recommend? Or what do you recommend? Like, a true leader would allow the final decision maybe to rest with them, but have everybody else involved. And I see that sometimes, and then other times I don't see that. So I think this is a really interesting study when ego is like the thing, the sticking point, let's say a business growing or failing.
Yeah, again, I mean, I think it goes back to there's a foundational aspect of it, but how do you want to win? Do you want to win by yourself, or do you want to win with a team? So if you want to win with a team, you're probably going to start to adapt, be flexible, and also take risk, right? So the second one, nearly 2/3 of executives never explore alternatives because they probably got a decision and they want to stick to that decision. And to risk it would probably be like a social risk of looking wrong. And if you look wrong, then there's a social aspect of it. And that's a huge fear for people. A lot of people don't like to go off in public speaking and stuff like that because it's more of a social thing than anything, right? How am I going to be ridiculed or scorned from my peers? So The ego is like, how do I not risk and still be in charge, right? How do I not look bad and still be in charge?
Which is funny because if I respect people that get like new information and will radically change huge sets and subsets of their views. Because if you got better information and it was clear to you that this was at least a step more correctly in the right direction of understanding a concept or a thing, rejecting like new information is crazy to me.
What if it threatened your value though at the company?
Yeah, I mean, well, what if I had someone on my team? Sam Altman did a podcast with the All In Pod 3 days ago. And he said, what I look for, he's in an AI, he wants to create an AI that does this, but he's like, I basically have team members that I'm trying to train AI to act like, and it's a upper executive or an upper level manager that will come to me and will push back, or they'll say, or not do what I say entirely, or they'll say, I can do that if you want, but my thought is if I do that, it's going to look like this. Do you still want me to do that? Which is fascinating. You know, because it's like that there is real merit that ultimately says, hey, I'm willing to challenge you. Now, if it's a CEO that would never allow that sort of pushback, then that seems to go in line with what we're talking about here. But there's like a real merit from one of the most successful dudes ever, like the center of the center
That's
of
why
AI.
he's successful.
Right, for real.
Because he's willing to be challenged.
Yeah.
And be subjective. I mean, you and I talked about that in terms of like the leaders, if we chunk laterally to the president of the United States, like why won't they be having open debate?
Yeah.
Because they don't want to be subjective to being incorrect or looking bad in front of their social peers, right? It's all about looking good and getting the votes. Let's go back to here though. If someone who's in a managerial position all of a sudden is looking bad, right? That might threaten their value of how much they deliver to the company, and their values tied toward the money that they income producing, and also come back to, are they providing for their family? So it always comes back to that survival mechanism, right? So if someone's like, oh, I'm not going to risk this because then I'm not as valuable.
Do you feel like in a debate, like let's talk like the RNC, like Republican debate or something, what if some figure calls out someone else on the platform and they correct them wholesale on a topic like, well, this is where you're wrong. Here's actually the data points. In my head, playing the scenario out, person on the receiving end of that, what if they went and said, you know what? You make a fantastic point. I appreciate you bringing that up. And I actually may trust that data point, and that may be the new direction that we go. When I become president of the United States, you're like, it's important to listen to your peers. It's important to listen to the people around you, to gather it, because it can't just be me. It's a team, and we are Team America.
Yeah.
Tell me that wouldn't be the best, like, 180 on any kind of debate stage. Like, what are you going to do? Be like, no, wait, I hate how well that's working out for you. Like, that's a really good sign of flexibility.
I can only hope that we have a president one day that does that.
Dude, how cool would that be? How cool would that be?
Yeah, their peers might push back when they get back and be like, what were you doing?
Exactly.
Improvising, baby.
Remember the lobbyists. Remember who's paying you. Remember who's funding this.
Oh, shoot, yeah.
Do you know how many laws we have being written over here for what you just went against?
Yeah, that's true, huh? We have all this super PAC money. We have all of these like private. That's not the direction we were going, brother.
Yeah. It's
crap. That's a good point. I hate that.
I mean, whole nother conversation chunks. But I mean, that's when we've talked about this before. That's why I like RFK to his willingness to at least debate and be wrong. Now, I wouldn't say that on everything like he's willing to change, but I do believe that's why he's been like, come on a podcast with me. Let's talk about it. Here's my data that I have right here, right now. If you have different data, let's bring it on Joe Rogan podcast. Remember that I forget the doctor's name.
Oh, yeah.
And he was like, let's bring it here right now. Let's just talk about it.
He said he'd pay him like $100,000 just to do it.
Yeah, Joe Rogan was going to pay him.
Right.
And then I think there's a willingness to at least be like, okay, if you do have something I don't know about, let's talk about it, right? Because he's looking at it, this is for the health of America. Because we're talking about vaccines, and he's like, we're talking about the health of human beings. So this is why I have, and this is why I believe strongly that it shouldn't be given to children. Tell me why I'm wrong. Show me some data, right? So that's all he was saying.
Yeah.
I do believe that's a quality and a leader that I want.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
And it's a quality in what I want to see and surround myself with. You know, chunking back to us today, the listener, the way to start seeing flexibility in other people is to first find it within yourself and to ask where your mirrors are. What can I learn from things? It's not your fault, but there is a lesson probably attached to a tire going flat or something else. Like, oh, I was too preoccupied with these other things. I didn't notice my tire flat icon. It's something simple like that, and you can go as deep as you want. If I see 1111 on the microwave, does this mean that like tomorrow $10 million will be wired? Maybe. But also, that's right. But I also attribute, I'm like, the path is clear. Like, it looks like 2 highway lanes. Like, we're going up, you know? It's whatever you make of it.
Let's talk about the final point of how do we dissolve the problems that come with an ego or the negative effects of an ego. I think that one of the things that may or may not be obvious by this point to the listeners who have been listening to us is typically ego is when someone, well, the negative effects of ego occurs when someone's very zoomed in to space and time, meaning we tend to think quarterly or here are the goals for the week. I found myself doing that sometimes. Like this week I got to do this. Or quarterly, we got to make X amount. But there are countries out there looking at 100, 1,000, or even thousands of years ahead. And then there's the circle, right? Are we thinking about just me, just my family as the circle? Or are we thinking about our community, the state, the country, and the globe and beyond? So depending on how zoomed in someone is in space and in time, it increases their ego or the negative effects of their ego or decreases the negative effects. And the more zoomed out we're willing to be, the less ego we'll have.
Wow.
And to piggyback off that, why I believe in the effectiveness and I have such conviction about the work that we do at Upgrade, it's because whether someone wants to admit it or not, unconsciously they are thinking that. Consciously they may not be aware, right? Because I know plenty of people who don't even think quarterly, dude. They don't even think about their daily goals, right? But that's consciously. Unconsciously, their actions, their words are affecting those things long term. Unconsciously, their language and their behaviors are affecting countries and nations and generations of their families. But we talk about this a lot. 5% of the mind is only used by most of human beings. They've never tapped into that 95%. And until they tap into that 95%, how could they expect to have influence over the world long term?
This makes me think we can wrap on your Instagram story today.
Wait, which one? What did I write?
You are experiencing mental programming at all times in your environment, good or bad. That is why your mind is the asset that must be worked on the most and understood best, because Jung said it, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate.
Jung's a baller.
Mic drop from Michael Mahoney.
Yeah.
It's like that Michael Scott thing where it's like you don't, Wayne Gretzky admits every shot you don't take. Wayne Gretzky, Michael Scott.
Heck yeah.
Well, great episode, guys. I'm excited to do another one. And if it's your first time on the show, be sure to like and subscribe. As you can tell, this is a podcast that is a little different from most of them. So happy to have you along for the journey.
Have a great day, everyone.